Good afternoon. Welcome to our last budget hearing of this year's budget hearings. We are so glad to be joined by Secretary Ori Monson, the Secretary of the Budget for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Before we begin, Chairman Struzzi, any introductory comments?
Yes. Thank you, Chairman Harris. Good afternoon. Secretary Monson, it's good to have you here. I know we have a lot to get through, so we will go ahead and get started. I just want to highlight very quickly for the executive offices, the governor's office and lieutenant governor, the request is $344.6 million, which is actually a decrease of about $14 million or negative 3.92%. So with that said, we can go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. Of course, you have been here before, so you know this process. In the middle is our timekeeper. We're going to try to stick to our time as much as possible so that everyone, so that we can get as many questions as possible. 5 minutes for each member. When they begin, it will be green, 30 seconds is yellow. At red, we ask that folks would conclude their comments. Mr. Secretary, for you, stand so we can swear you in. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, so help you God? Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We are going to begin. Representative Kale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. Congratulations on getting to your last hearing here. I'm sure it's a exhilarating process for you. You know, as a small business owner, one of the things that I have learned through the course of my career is that forecasting is very important. Long-term planning is essential to how you run your operation, how you can run your business, and how you can grow your business. And I just have some questions as it relates to the long-term planning of the fiscal situation within the Commonwealth. In 23-24, the budget there, the governor's budget, increased spending by 5.8%. In 24-25, the increase was another 5.4%. And the projected budget, the proposed budget rather, this year is an increase in spending by 7.5%. Yet the forecast that we have seen over the course of the next 4 years is 1.3% increase, 1.1% increase, and 1.2% increase. Judging by the increases that we have seen over the course of the last couple of years, is it realistic to believe that that will actually be the proposed budget in years to come?
Is this on? Yeah. As I'm sure you're aware, Article 12 of the Constitution delineates that, how the 5-year plan is put together and differentiates between the budget year and then the out years or financial plan. The GFOA has very specific training about the 3 roles of a budget office. So there's budgeting, there's financial planning, and there's monitoring. Budget is about 1-year revenues and expenditures. Financial planning is more about general overall kind of big ideas where you're headed type pieces. We, consistent with, as far as I can tell, at least decades worth, the approach is that what is set, we put in. So for example, labor contracts are included in there. We do put an increase for related to MCO rates because we have to renegotiate those contracts in the calendar year, mid-year, so it's off the cycle. We do not include increases beyond that because every single year, no one is giving us a 2-year or 3-year or 4-year appropriation authority, so we come back every year, and it's not a concept of doing consecutive 5-year plans. It's that every year you come back and say, okay, we have new information, so we need to start over and see what will happen and what we want to do. And I think particularly this year, given, and I'm sure we'll talk about more of this with what's going on with the federal government, we're probably going to have more significant discussions about what could be a very different world.
Well, it is concerning to me because last year, I believe the forecast for this year was something like 3%, and there was a proposed budget of 7.5%. And if we can't get accurate or realistic or serious forecasts, I'm not sure what that's doing for us from a planning standpoint. I'd like to move on to the rainy day fund and the spending that we're seeing there. This year, we're transferring another $1.6 billion. And if we keep going down the path that we have been going, the rainy day fund is probably going to be depleted in a couple of years. Does the administration have a plan for what they're going to do once that fund is depleted? And what is that plan?
So first of all, I wouldn't characterize it as a transfer, another transfer. It'd actually be the first transfer. We have not touched the rainy day fund, number one. Number two, we obviously have time over the 5 years to kind of see where things are, see if what happens with revenues, with the new revenues we're proposing and we have proposed before. We have a comprehensive proposal. If the revenue, the skill games, cannabis, et cetera, had been approved, had been instituted when we first done it, we would have already had another $850 million on the table and probably having different discussions. The largest driver of the growth this year is in the MCO rates. And I know you guys got a lot of quality time with Secretary Arkush. And what's actually helpful about that is it was very different from previous years, and we understand what drove it, and we have mitigating issues. So I think the ability to control those costs, as well as other pieces we're taking on, such as a remap and other ways of looking at ways to reduce costs in the future.
Quickly, if I can just ask a couple more questions. The first is, what's the projected revenue for 25, 26?
Revenue growth is like 3.1%.
What's the number?
Actual total revenue number is for 25, 26, 49,518,376.
49 billion? Mm-hmm. And the proposed budget is what?
51 billion.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, gentlemen. Representative Curry.
Thank you, Chairman. Hello, Secretary. On February 25th, 2025, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a budget resolution that proposes to decrease funding by Medicaid by $880 billion over the next 10 years. With such a large decrease to the medical assistance program, can you comment on how likely it is for Pennsylvania to continue operating Medicaid as it currently operates?
So we have 3 million citizens who get Medicaid benefits, and it's a Commonwealth-wide issue. I think I read that 45, I was kind of amazed, it says 45 of our counties, over 20% or more of their population is on Medicaid. So obviously the impacts are significant. It's a significant funding. I'm hesitant to comment on any single part because there's so many pieces that are up in the air around what I kind of describe it as it's a redefinition of the compact between the federal government and the states.
Yeah.
And I think there's no question that whether it's through a CR, if that happens, or whenever there's another federal budget and we know what the priorities are going forward, that the reality is we're probably going to have to come back, the administration with the House and the Senate, to have a discussion about what it looks like. But you're talking about such a potentially seismic change in that relationship and that funding that it's just rethinking the entire way we do business.
Possibly a catastrophic event. On Tuesday, we heard from the Secretary of Human Services that the $880 billion decrease over the next 10 years would mean two things. One, less people will be covered by the program, and two, less services will be available to those that are covered. The DHS Secretary shared that these cuts would have devastating effects on the Pennsylvania hospitals, causing strain on our hospitals, which we know are already struggling financially. Would you agree that this will continue to force hospitals into more consolidations or to possibly close, which we know is happening in real time in Delaware County?
So I don't think people fully appreciate the downstream effects of all of this. Specifically, obviously, and Secretary Arkush, I know, spoke eloquently about the downstream impacts on delivery of health services in hospitals. But you're also talking about taking lots of money out of local communities, local economies. There are impacts that go there's serious impacts on the folks who currently get those services directly, but the indirect impacts are immeasurable.
Yeah, the indirect impacts are immeasurable when we think about an entire hospital system closing, which we're not just talking about the hospital itself and that care, we're talking about offices and things where people go in to get their services every day. So during our hearings with the Department of Health and the Department of Human Services, we heard about this impact that the hospital consolidations and closures have had on access to healthcare services. As we've talked about, this is especially difficult for rural residents that have to travel long distances to get to care. The proposed budget includes $40 million in state funds within the Department of Human Services budget to fund payments to hospitals, including rural hospitals, and patient safety. Do you think with the proposed decrease in federal funding for Medicaid and the potential end to federal health care subsidies available through Penny, that this funding will be enough to support our hospitals?
I'm trying to stay away from big hypotheticals.
Okay.
I understand. I think those are the right questions to ask, and I think our goal has been both throughout the process of current year holding of funds, as well as thinking about going forward. We want to make sure we have all the data, that every agency has everything. So whatever happens, we're prepared to have those discussions, that we can have informed discussions and understand everything from the DHS data to the downstream to the hospitals impacted to the rural health. So the point is going to be to have an informed discussion when that happens, but I'm try very hard so I can sleep at night, not to have the speculative
I
discussion.
appreciate that, Secretary. And with the interest of time, I just want to ask, recently hospital acquisitions have occurred by private equity ownership. These owners have, in 2 cases, bankrupted the hospitals and forced communities to make tough decisions about keeping needed healthcare services in place. We know that it's happening in real time today. What are your thoughts on private equity ownership of hospitals?
So I think the governor spoke eloquently about that during his address about his concerns, and I think we all have. Private equity has its place, but the primary mission of those funds are to make a profit, and that is not the primary goal of these medical services being delivered. So we have to make sure that the care for patients, the medical care being provided, is foremost when evaluating what's happening.
Thank you, Secretary. This is a life or death situation. I hope we can pay serious attention to it. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady, Representative Flood.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Secretary, for being here. Mr. Secretary, I'd like to follow up on a point that Representative Ulsimer raised about Auditor General DeFore's audit of DCNR's grant program. I'm concerned about the number of state agency grant programs and the increase in spending without more transparency in how such decisions are being made. For example, this committee expressed concern last year about fiscal accountability with the Department of Agriculture's new Agricultural Innovation Development Program when it was first proposed with $10 million, and now an additional $15 million is being requested. We raised this concern with Secretary Reding last week, not simply because of the significant increase, but this new program already awarded all $10 million in less than a year, as was announced last month. So I ask you, Mr. Secretary, are you concerned that grant funding is not being reviewed and awarded properly as intended, especially when there is no oversight or input from the General Assembly or stakeholders?
So my understanding is that the funds were awarded in accordance with whatever statutory requirements were put in the approval of the budget, whatever those would be. Grant programs do follow a process. This may be the first time anyone's complained about how quickly we've done something and gotten the money out, so I actually would consider that a positive. The goal of allocating the money is to get it out so it can do good things, and I think it was something like 88 awards or something. I know they were oversubscribed. I know there was a lot of excitement, and they got a lot of proposals. I'm obviously not part of the group that evaluates the proposals, but Every process I know where we have that kind of review are reviewed in accordance with whatever guidelines were put out, and I'm sure scored appropriately. And we have, I'm chair of the Commonwealth Audit Committee, and we do audits of lots of things all the time in conjunction with OSIG, with the Auditor General, as well as our outside auditors. And no concerns have been raised about that, but happy to have conversations with the Auditor General as he would see fit.
Well, again, I guess the question and the overall perception of how these funds are being awarded without oversight or input, why should the General Assembly continue to approve and support more discretionary grant funding for this or any agency without any additional oversight when both we and the IFO warned of dire fiscal and revenue cost issues facing the Commonwealth?
So I think the General Assembly has the ability through legislation, through fiscal code, through any of the budgets to put in whatever restrictions. I mean, look, we just did the borrowing for the PA sites bonds, and there are pieces in there that define how it's going to be used, what types of projects might be eligible, et cetera. I do think that there needs to be a balance between requirements and flexibility, because especially when you're talking about innovation grants or, we talk about wanting to move at the speed of business, and sadly government will never quite work at the speed of business, but in order for us to keep up with what the needs of business are, we need to make sure we can be flexible. So I agree with you that it's a balancing act, and I'm happy to continue to have conversations about how we might make sure that we're meeting your concerns while maintaining those appropriate roles between the legislative and the executive branches.
Well, I say this, and I ask these questions because I cannot honestly explain to my local farmers how grant funding decisions and priorities are being made and why more grant programs are added. This is especially concerning when other funding and needs do not get the same consideration like avian flu funding, because in their minds, perception is reality. And I have dead birds in my district in Northampton County, and making sure the proper funding for testing and cleanup is there for them. I think that this is more troubling. What's more troubling is that it appears the governor is more interested in spending money on grant programs and shifting it from priority ag preparedness and response funding, although you state prior year funding is available. So I must ask, was this your recommendation or a decision to shift these funds?
So we are not taking money out of the preparedness fund. We're just not putting more money in. It has a very significant balance at the moment. I think over $60 million, and we went back and looked last time we had a significant outbreak, and I recognize what's going on right now, so I'm cognizant of that, both locally and nationally. And that was a little over $9 million, so we feel comfortable that we have what is available. So we, rather than putting additional money into there, which would just sit and not be needed in our, based on our risk analysis, putting it to work, but staying within ag. So we wanted to maintain it in there, and that was really kind of how that came about.
So thank you for your response, and you can understand why it's been so concerning for us, especially when we're potentially thinking about 2022 outbreak with the avian flu, and also farmers dealing with biosolid soil contamination and issues like that. We just want to make sure that the funding is available, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady, Representative Siegel.
Thank you, Secretary Munson. As we conclude our appropriations hearing with you, you're going to obviously have a lot of questions today about the budget and certainly long-term financial implications for the Commonwealth. And when I think of the budget, I think of the old Greek proverb that society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they'll never sit in. And I think the best investments are the ones that we make with a long-term mindset in play. And I want to talk specifically about the governor's housing policy that he proposed in this year's budget. As we know, there's a significant housing crisis across the Commonwealth and frankly across the country. There's a significant shortage of available housing stock, as well as older housing stock that we need to upkeep and maintain. Can you just talk a little bit about some of the governor's broader policy priorities as it relates to housing affordability, increasing the supply of housing, and repairing older homes?
Happy to do so, thank you. I think as most of you know, last fall the governor issued an executive order on housing, formed a committee to oversee. I serve on that. The first thing we did was gather data and input. So I would not at all of them, but we did, I think, 20 round tables around the Commonwealth. The ones I attended were fascinating because it was not the usual suspects. So we had nonprofits, government agencies, human services agencies, labor, developers, really a fascinating from the local housing authorities, et cetera, and learned a lot. And we're still gathering all that information. We'll come out with a full report for the governor shortly. But there were certain themes we heard during that we didn't want to wait for, and the governor didn't want to wait for. So just a few pieces that FAIR program, we'd already been proposing to increase. We're actually putting the budget to increase it more over time. Everyone said FAIR was good. My general belief in my 30-plus years in public service is when you find a tool that works, double down on it. So I think that's kind of our approach. We have very old housing stock in the Commonwealth. I'm not going to give the percentage because I always screw it up, so I'm just going to let it go. But it's easier to preserve the housing you have. So the $50 million for revitalization of existing stock. We heard a lot about how local municipalities, et cetera, struggle with some of local zoning issues, permitting around, and we have a planning board, which has been staffed by existing DCED staff, but doesn't have committed staff. So we are proposing to fully staff that board, and the idea being that they can provide supports to local governments as they, whether there are good zoning standards or other issues, but to kind of streamline that in a supportive manner. And then first-time homebuyers program, which I think is really important. And I've been likening it a bit to when we think about some of our DCED investments, we're not funding the whole thing, but we're that last dollar in to help move things forward. So if you think about someone who's looking at buying a home, and obviously we have limited stock, so housing prices are high, interest rates have been too high for too long, and I think if someone has the home, can afford the home, but can't close that on the closing costs, this is what we want to help with, and just that keeps that money in their pockets. They can start that becoming, what home ownership does for the community, part of that community, generational wealth, all the good things that come from that. We want to make sure we're the kind of that last dollar to help in means tested for those who are trying to get over that last hump to get to that home ownership stage.
I appreciate that, and I think it reflects a comprehensive understanding of some of the challenges we face in the Commonwealth. I know, representing the Lehigh Valley, I hear frequently from developers that we need to cut red tape, we need to expedite the permitting and approval process to reduce that cost to carry so that we can develop and build inventory faster. I think that's a critical component. Local municipalities, we need to work with them in a collaborative fashion to make sure that their zoning laws are permissive of different types of housing stock, especially missing middle. And I think I agree, we need to help more first-time home buyers, and the interest rates are punishing. My wife and I bought a home last year, and my mortgage rate is brutal. Every time I talk about my dad's mortgage interest rate, I get a little frustrated. So some folks are locked into the homes they bought years ago, to be frank. But I do think when we talk about the long-term trajectory of the Commonwealth, what I appreciate most, and I think we need to acknowledge and recognize, is there is no economic development or economic growth if we don't have the corresponding housing stock to make sure we can house that workforce. And I think that that's the sense of urgency we need to share. So I think these are good initial down payments, but I look forward to the executive order and the Housing Commission's final plan, because I believe we cannot grow the Commonwealth if we can't house a workforce in affordable and attainable housing stock. And so I think that's going to be a long-term barrier to our state's economic well-being. So thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Secretary, if you could pull that microphone a little bit closer to you. Representative Alsomer.
Thank you, Chairman Harris. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. Mr. Secretary, in my district, we're asking for common sense solutions on a case-by-case basis when working with state agencies like DEP. Last week, I highlighted a concern I had regarding DEP drinking water regulations and their impact on the availability of childcare in my district. Acting Secretary Shirley gave her word that she would work with us, and I look forward to taking her up on that. Unfortunately, for years, we've seen how land developers, farmers, and businesses trying to expand often wait months or even years for DEP permits. particularly for land development projects in my district. My constituents in Wayne and Pike County argue that these agencies impose ever-changing environmental standards without clear guidelines, making it difficult for businesses to comply. Speaking of guidelines, we see a similar theme at DCNR. Concerns have been raised regarding the agency's ability to follow established policies. Auditor General DeFore released a performance audit report on February 13th, 2025, highlighting that DCNR ignored policies when awarding grants, did not award all grants competitively, and used its own discretion when awarding grants despite saying it was transparent and competitive process. Have you discussed this report with DCNR executive staff, and do you agree with the assessments made in the report?
So I have not reviewed the report as of yet. I will be completely honest that I have been a little focused the past few weeks on preparing our folks for the budget hearings and tracking the hearings. But I review every audit report that comes out when they are for our agencies to understand what's in there. I want to see most audits should have the agency's response, so I'd like to review that. And if I have follow-up questions, both for the Auditor General and for the agency, I will review them with them. And we can also take them up. You know, as I said, I'm chair of the Audit Committee. We meet regularly. Auditor General is a participant as well as OSIG and others. So it's definitely something I would follow up on. I just would ask you to some allowance for the fact that it's the middle of budget season.
Understood. Would you support such audits of other agency grant programs and reviews by the Auditor General to assure there is more transparency and confidence in how these are managed?
So, I mean, the Auditor General is free to audit whatever falls under his jurisdiction, and there's an audit schedule. And I should say there's, so there are internal audits that are done by a team in the Comptroller's office. OSIG has the ability to audit. The Auditor General has the ability to audit, as well as we have an independent audit every year who reviews not just our financials, but our internal controls and our entire process. So there are, I think I counted once, there's usually like something like 50 or 60 audits going on of one degree or another a quarter. So, you know, I'm always happy to engage. And my view of it, like, I've been in government finance for 30 years, and audits are not a bad thing in my mind. It's just they're learning opportunities, and someone else looking at something and maybe giving feedback on what you're doing or how you're doing it, I would welcome that.
Does your office staff monitor and review agency grant programs to ensure criteria and guidelines are followed?
So there are different elements to be reviewed by whether or not it's, everything is reviewed, whether before funds go out to make sure that any legal requirements were met, that process was followed, et cetera. So yes, whether it's budget or sometimes general counsel, you know, the folks who are embedded in the individual agencies will track, but before we send anything forward to the treasurer for payment or release of funds, there's a review process.
And you review that for all agencies?
For all agencies under the governor's jurisdiction, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Representative Webster.
Thank you, Chairman. I think I jumped the line a little bit, and I apologize for not being ready. Thank you, sir, for being here. Quick question. I think the governor's budget accelerates business taxes. We've done a good job in talking about corporate net income tax. We want to attract and grow business in Pennsylvania. And then what about the workforce? that goes along with that, right? So I sometimes quote Secretary Siger, and we've had this discussion back and forth. He reminds us that, you know, the best companies want the best employees. So whether it's private sector nurses or public sector nurses and teachers, whether it's high-skilled math and cybersecurity professionals, how does the budget enhance our ability to attract, you know, a modern workforce?
So one of the themes for the governor throughout a lot of areas is meeting people where they are. And that is a constant theme that everyone in the cabinet hears, and I think you can see throughout our workforce approaches in this budget. So you have breaking out WEDNet into its own line and increasing, I think, by 25% the funding there. And the goal of that is to have people in jobs, companies that, you know, they already have that relationship. How do we upskill them and enhancing their skills, they can move up within those companies. We have focus on adult literacy and those who never graduated high school. How do we get them the GEDs and the job skills and the job training to get them into the workforce where they are not already? Obviously, there's been a lot of focus on higher education, as well as Grow PA in the areas that it covers. I think there's the teacher stipend, and you know, I can tell you from my time in the Philly School District that it's a real hardship for people who go through the degree, have to do the student teaching, and have to do it for free. And we've seen with the oversubscription, and you know, created the program the first year at 10, 20 still oversubscribed. We're proposing to double that again. So get people in that teacher pipeline. A lot of this, there's a combination of short-term and long-term. So what are you doing for those things? We have wonderful higher education schools in our system in Pennsylvania. We have people who come from all around the country, all around the world to come study there, and then they leave with all the skills we've given them. So building the connections programs so that we can incent internships so that while they're here, they can make those connections with Pennsylvania-based companies, and they can hopefully take the knowledge that they have gained and keep it here and build their families here. Programs, investments in behavioral health, nursing health, nurses to, again, pipeline, get people, and send people to go into those fields where we know we have high demand.
I think that's the answer to the question, and connecting the dots holistically across Pennsylvania. So good for business, good for workers, quality of life for our families, and that's how we move Pennsylvania forward. And I'm excited by the opportunity and look forward to working with the administration to play that out over the next few months. Thank you.
Thank you, gentleman. Representative Vanzo.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Munson, for your time today. During the governor's budget address, he stated he directed your office to conduct a comprehensive review of every program we offer in the Commonwealth, identify inefficiencies and costs could be eliminated. This program is called REMAP. It was my understanding that the pilot program that was involved the Department of Corrections, DCED, and Pennsylvania Commission of Crime and Delinquency. Is that correct?
Yes.
At a later time, you don't have to today, but could you provide both chairmen with the findings of the report that the office has done?
So the findings are incorporated into the budget. Okay. All those recommendations, some are, I know there's been a lot of attention on the recommendation for closures of 2 SCI facilities, but a lot of the recommendations around the tax changes for DCED, changing that toolbox come out of there and realigning. But there are some briefing documents we've put out that were in some of our public presentations that I'll be happy to share with the chair.
Right. Perfect. Appreciate that. And on the efficiency line, as we finish up the final appropriation hearings, there was only 2 state agencies that mentioned they had staffing issues. Can you explain the governor's executive order yesterday to recruit some 600 federal employees who were either let go, laid off, or quit their jobs for reasons like refusing to go back to the office or to simply ask a question, what did you do last week? These are pretty simple requirements.
So it's sort of similar to what I was just saying about DCD, about making sure you have all the tools in the tool belt. Because of what's happening in DC, there are folks becoming available in the workforce who have a singular series of skills that you don't normally see. And to make sure that it's not that we're going to hire them regardless, or a hiring program. It's that if we have openings, to make sure that there are no hindrances to bringing them on if they have the skills we need for open positions we have. We're not creating positions for them. And obviously, the funding we have is dependent on whatever appropriation we have, et cetera. But making sure that if we have folks who are available who have skills, for example, who might help us with our permitting process to continue to speed that up, and they're available, we want to make sure that we have every available resource to bring them on to fill open positions.
All right, and on that, there's also a push, some legislative, and I heard the governor say residency requirements for employment, right? So we want to, from my understanding, in one of his speeches there, we want to level the playing field for residency requirements, making it not necessary to live in the Commonwealth with somebody's 600 employees. So I just want to put this out there that a Pennsylvania employee can live in Virginia, be teleworking from Virginia, all while collecting a Pennsylvania paycheck from Pennsylvania tax dollars here. Would that be accurate?
I'm not aware of that part. I'd have to look at more. I know it just came out yesterday. I'd have to look at that part.
So, there is a push, there is legislation being pushed out there, and I hope at some point in time we pump the brakes, because if these positions weren't filled for the last 2.5, 3 years, I think we need to do another comprehensive dive. Do we really need these positions? I'm sure there's areas that we do. I'm not going to say that. But just because they're out there, I don't feel that Governor Shapiro should be jumping into a fight with President Trump on saving a day for some of these federal workers. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Representative Khan.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Munson. And I want to first thank you and thank the governor for all the work that you've done to put together a sensible budget, and also, quite frankly, making sure that we're getting our top quality talent here in Pennsylvania. If there is high quality talent in Virginia or in California and they want to do Pennsylvania work, I'm all about bringing those people in. So my first question is about the workforce. In Pennsylvania, the median age continues to go up, and there's a brain drain. We have the doctors, I think 1 in 6 of our doctors in the U.S. are actually trained here and trained in my area in Philadelphia, right here in Pennsylvania. We have a lot of people that as they finish college, as they finish graduate school, they leave the state. Can you talk about some of the investments that you're doing to bring young families to move into Pennsylvania and to keep those that are here to make sure that they want to stay?
So I think it covers all the areas that will impact young families. So, we talked about the workforce efforts already previously, but I think education is certainly a major investment there, so that there are, and I'll actually take a step back, childcare and pre-K leading education. And it's interesting because it's both for that group, but it's one of the priorities we've been hearing from the business community. It's been one of the most interesting things since I've been in this job, is that I expect the priority one to always be an issue about tax rates, but the number 2 issue has been childcare since I've been here. And they draw the clear path that if their folks do not have reliable childcare, they cannot be committed to the workforce. That they can't rely on them, and that it hurts them. So, we have major investments in here in childcare. $55 million for providers to increase the salaries of those, get people in the door to do those jobs, and which not only has the benefits now of incenting young families to be here and to stay and help provide for them, but also, and I can say this from my experience in the Philly School District, the students who went through early childcare and pre-K and Head Start are better prepared when they hit kindergarten. So these are investments that will pay off down the road in that regard for even the next generation of future Pennsylvania residents. But I think those all build on each other. And I think the other piece I should mention on this, and I should have mentioned also on the workforce, is the call for the minimum wage change. We have the lowest minimum wage of all of our surrounding states, and leaving aside the actual dollar side of it, it's the messaging we're sending that we don't value. And I think I said that here last year, and it's still the same. It's that the general messaging we have is, yeah, we don't care. And no one's going to be able to afford the housing and the childcare and clothing and food and all those other things at $7.25 an hour.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you brought up minimum wage because, especially now when we see that prices continue to go up and, the price of eggs, the price of goods, just to go out to dinner, it's so expensive and people are struggling. And we see even just in the last month with these tariffs coming out of Washington, where people are we're having to pay for it. It's not the corporations, it's being passed on to us. And we have hardworking taxpayers here in Pennsylvania that are bearing the brunt of it. And some of those people who are making the lowest wages are stuck in those same wages that they were making 15 years ago. Before, my nephews are going into middle school. They weren't even born when the last time we increased the minimum wage in Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, inflation continues to go up. So can you talk a little bit about the economic impact? You talk a little bit about the impact on the families that are going to be getting the minimum wage increase, $15 an hour. But can you talk a little bit about the economic impact that's going to have on Pennsylvania and to our economy?
So, and look, there are estimates built into our budget about both the increases in PIT and sales tax from folks making a higher wage. There's also some loss from profit that business would have by paying higher salaries. What we don't include is when you think about these salaries and these folks, this is money that's going to be spent locally. This is money that's going to be spent in local stores, buying clothing. These aren't people who are flying out to Europe and spending the money there. There are economic estimates that the impact is anywhere from 1.2 to 1.5 times the value in local business, the local economy. How that drives out people buying more things, going out to restaurants, whatever that is. It's disposable income, but disposable income that tends to stay local. We don't account for that in the budget. That would be a dynamic, we try to be conservative there because you don't know exactly what's going to happen. But overall, you're basically pushing more money out into the local economies across the Commonwealth.
Thank you so much, Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Representative Mako.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Secretary, for being here. Appreciate your service to the Commonwealth. So my question has to do with the Property Tax Relief Fund. For the past 2 years, it seems that there's been an intentional under-certifying of the Property Tax Relief Fund, denying up to $350 million that could be going out. For the past 2 years, we believe that there could be a certification of over $1 billion that could be used for the Property Tax Relief Fund. I had an amendment that passed this chamber, bipartisan support, went over to the Senate, got pulled out last minute in a negotiation, just saying, hey, recertify it, get over $1 billion. I was hoping that in 2024 to 2025, we would have had that certification over $1 billion. Grateful that this year we're finally breaking the $1 billion that we can give back to the Property Tax Relief Fund for Pennsylvanians. But it seems that there, once again, is an under-certifying of this amount for the Property Tax Relief Fund. I think there's $1.3 billion in it right now, but you're set to certify 1.02. So my question is, why not the 1.03 or 1.3? And why are we under-certifying these funds that taxpayers desperately need? I can say this is one of the number one issues in my district. These people deserve it and rely on it.
Thank you, and it's interesting. I actually looked back at the statute that authorizes the certification of the number. It's one of the few statutes I've actually seen which requires the budget secretary not only to certify, but to take into account the viability and sustainability of that number over 5 years.
Okay.
And I take that very seriously, and we really do that 5-year forecast for that, because I think the worst thing we could do is certify, given how it impacts schools, given how it impacts local taxes, to certify to a number and then have to pull it back.
Right.
I appreciate the 1-year look and how it appears. Believe me, and as you know, there's a proposed number, and we look at it again. We have the better numbers in the spring. If we can, I'm more than happy to do the most we can do. I share that goal.
I appreciate that.
But I also have to, I want to be very clear about that. But I'm also looking at over the 5 years, which I would do anyway, but it's interesting that it's explicit in that language there. But we do look at that very carefully and look at all the draws on that fund and what's sustainable over time.
I appreciate it. No, I just was looking at it. I had an amendment on a bill last year and wanted to know why we're not doing the most we can, but I appreciate your answer, and that's all I had, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Representative Kozarowski.
Thank you, and thank you for being here today with us. I wanted to say that today and over the past couple weeks, we've heard much about spending and that it is an aggressive proposed budget. But I trust that you and I trust that the governor will recognize the fiscal realities we have here in our state and the needs of Pennsylvanians. So thank you for what you are doing. This morning, or this afternoon earlier, Representative Curry spoke specifically about hospital closures, Medicaid, and I know it's hard to speak in hypotheticals. I mean, we are being told this $880 billion over the next 10-year cut on the federal government towards Medicaid, SNAP, and what that would do to our hospitals. So again, knowing that it's hard to speak in hypotheticals, and we do have to wait to see what happens, the governor spoke specifically in his budget proposal, including $40 million in state funds within the Department of Human Services to fund payments to hospitals, including rural hospitals, patient safety. So I wanted to just kind of ask your thoughts about, with that potential decrease in federal funding for Medicaid and the potential end to the federal health care subsidies available through Penny, do you think that funding, that $40 million, is sufficient? I mean, clearly, I don't think it is sufficient, so it's another hypothetical question, but I know that, we are facing catastrophic closures and mergers. And we heard about what's happening in Delco, and I represent the city of Scranton, and we're next on the list. I don't like to see that kind of news today because, we are actually actively working to keep our hospital open. So can you talk a little bit about your thoughts in that kind of proposed budget?
Sure. So it's an interesting time to be doing this kind of work. I'll start with that. When we put together a budget in the governor's budget proposal, we base it based on what is, and that's all we can really do at a certain point. This is what the rules are. This is how things operate. This is the compact we've had with the federal government, our revenue expectations, et cetera. I said it before. I think I said it in my Senate hearing this morning. Depending on what actually happens, will change our outlook on everything, depending on where it is, and it's on the Medicaid $880 million numbers. I'll give you another example, which is really kind of in the weeds in my world. We talk about debt borrowing and things like that. Mm-hmm. There's a proposal to get rid of all tax-exempt borrowing and make it all taxable. Our last two bond issuances, general obligation issuances, if they had to be taxable, it would have cost us an additional $625 million in interest. Which means we would have to borrow less, which means less available facilities. That's not just a Pennsylvania problem, statewide. Every county, municipality, school district, airport, everyone who does borrowings right now. So last year alone, that number was $16.5 billion worth of tax-exempt debt. So that's $3.5 billion of additional interest. No one has that money, which means fewer school facilities being built, fewer police stations, all the things that we think about for capital. 25% of that fewer is available if they make that change. The $880 million is obviously the most dramatic, and we know the impact with 3 million Pennsylvanians who are on Medicaid. There are numerous pieces, and there are already some effects being felt by higher ed, and there are potential for funding streams that go to schools from IDEA, from title money, school lunch. There are things that will affect farmers. And this is part of I don't want to get into hypotheticals because the list is endless, and until we actually see what happens. But I am quite serious that depending on the timing of this, and obviously we have a federal budget that expires next Friday, which is a whole other issue, which I'm happy to discuss if you want. Well, maybe not happy, but I'm willing to discuss. But until we actually know what those changes are, what that relationship changes, what it means, we're going to have to come back and have that discussion because we're projecting to get $53 billion in the federal government next year.
Yeah.
And so it should be a cause for concern.
Yeah. So I know it's hypothetical, but these are proposed things that are happening, and they are catastrophic to our community. I mean, everything depends. Everybody needs health care. Everybody needs it. And I hope, and I know you're laser focused on making sure that, we have access. But when you talk about cutting that kind of monies and relying on the state to step in, and we don't have that kind of financial purse to do it, it's something that we really could be catastrophic, and we're seeing it in Delaware County today. So thank you.
Thank the gentlelady, Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Great to see you here. I'd like to talk a little bit about some differences in the budget perspective, and revenue projections in particular. Section 604B of the Admin Code, says that our IFO, the Independent Fiscal Office, they are to provide analysis, economic impact of tax and revenue proposals submitted by the governor or the Office of the Budget, your office. I'm confident that you're familiar with this week's, announcement, but the IFO numbers significantly differ from projections in the governor's budget. I mean, just the first year alone, if I'm understanding it correctly, IFO says generating $80 million. The governor's budget says over $870 million. I mean, that's a $800 million difference. Would you agree that's a significant difference between these two agencies?
I would agree that the assumptions the IFO making are different than the assumptions we're making.
Yes, and so as we're making those assumptions, and I realize your hands are a bit tied because your office is not able to do dynamic modeling. Is that correct? Static only?
We choose not to do that. I mean,
okay.
We're trying to be more conservative.
Okay, so we're trying to be more conservative.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's an 11 times difference in just this first year. And if we look at the two, like a $4 billion difference between what the IFO says and the governor's budget is saying $4 billion more, even trying to be conservative. And I realize those are just projections. Everybody, very complicated. Everybody's trying to do their best estimate. But if we look backwards at estimate performance, half of the months this past year, your office overestimated. And so that's about a 50% accuracy rate month to month. There were 4 months that your office was correct, 4 months they were low, about $100 million shortfall.
You're referring to the revenue, the monthly revenue estimate?
Yes, yes. So it's 50-50, about $100 million shortfall. But if we look at the big budget, that $4 million, even if it's 50%, so your office is half right, the IFO is half right, that's a $2 billion shortfall. If we're already using our rainy day funds to pay for day-to-day expenses, what do we do if we come in $2 billion short?
So, a lot to unpack in that. First of all, the month-to-month is you are correct that we were running ahead through November. We ran behind a little bit December, January, started to catch up last month. I think we're off by 0.2% year to date through February. And some of one of those months was timing. To give you an idea of how picayune you have to get in this stuff, since both Christmas Day and New Year's Day were holidays but fell on Wednesdays, which is a PIT.
I'm just talking big picture because we're really limited on time.
The big picture for me is annual, not monthly. And I'm saying we're within 0.2 and we're moving in the right direction on that. And we have, in our first 2 years, we have actually come in ahead of our projections and wildly ahead of where the IFO's projections were.
Well, and I agree, we want to be conservative.
And also, in terms of how we look at our projections, so our projection for year-over-year growth over the 5 years in revenues is 3.1%. If you go back 25 years, so that includes pandemic, stimulus, the 08-09 crash, boom and bust of tech. So you have a wider range. The average annual increase is 3.6%. I'm very comfortable where we are in our 3.1% estimate.
Okay, I appreciate that, and I think the IFO is comfortable as well. And we're looking at a considerable shortfall if both are half right. But I want to pivot on this because we could use dynamic modeling, and it's great to know. So some of the projects lost and canceled, I'm talking specifically energy projects, 11 projects since Reggie was announced, $7 billion in private investment. This is an article from Tenaska Power Plant, 1 million man-hours for that project. The Homer City premature, 75,000 man-hours for 2 outages a year is about 450,000 Boilermaker-only man-hour. How is the loss of energy workers impacting revenues in these coming budgets?
I don't have a breakdown of individual collections. We look at the overall. We do it, revenue does it, and looking at kind of the overall trends in different areas, total amount of income tax, which leads to PIT, sales tax, et cetera. I don't have it broken down by industry other than if there are industry challenges overall. I mean, you're going to ask me right now, the single biggest one, the largest employer in the state of Pennsylvania is the U.S. government. And if there's over 105,000 employees, and if they're doing massive layoffs, that's going to be a much bigger impact than almost anything you have on your list.
It does seem like our dependency on government and government funds and revenues is kind of putting us at a bit of an imbalance. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Secretary.
Thank the gentleman. Representative Waxman.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for being here. My first question, I just want to give you a second just to respond a little bit more on this question of the IFO and their analysis. There was some differences, I think, in the forecasting around two of the big issues, skill games and also the legalization of adult use marijuana. And I'm just wondering if you could touch on that briefly and give your thoughts on the differences. And then also, these are activities that are ongoing. And so I'd like to just also hear you address a little bit about, what we're losing by not moving on these activities and regulating and taxing them, the kind of revenue that we've lost, not just this year, but last year and before. And then I'd like to ask you some questions about the funding freeze, the federal funding freeze. So.
All right, I'll try and go quickly then for the first couple. So there are definitely differences of opinion about the licensing fees we can charge, which we have are decently how quickly we can get going. I don't think the IFO correctly realized that we have the largest medical marijuana system in the country, and we have an infrastructure to build on, that our ag team is ready to go, and that we can get things in quickly. And yes, we are recommending higher licensing fees, actually on both AUC and skill games. We have more games than we originally expected, and there are estimated to be anywhere from 70 to 80,000 skill machines currently in the Commonwealth. We're recommending 30,000 in year one, and then growing, I think, to 40,000 over 4 years. I think they vastly underestimated the per skill game amount, I know what the teams that were working on this, what they looked at, other states, both our own performance, what our VGT machines go, what our rates are, et cetera, and I'm fully confident in our estimates there. In terms of, in both of those cases, the activity is happening. As I said, we have possibly as many as 80,000 skill games. We know that folks are going over the bridge to Jersey or wherever to get marijuana and bring it back. We know that there's a black market for it and folks are utilizing it, which means the issues that result from them are happening already. PSP is already dealing with, and local communities are already dealing with, driving while under the influence. And I recognize that you can't actually test for it, but driving unsafely, folks can recognize that. And we've talked with PSP about what that means and the ability to regulate it, to have a say over it, to provide additional resources for law enforcement to deal with those issues, for workforce, for Department of Health, et cetera. And on the skill game side, there are, as I know you're familiar with in Philadelphia, the frustration with how do you restrict skill games in certain areas and zoning and ways around it, and local communities across the Commonwealth are dealing with that. And in the absence of a regulatory framework, it's impossible. And you end up with a wild, wild west. It also makes it really hard for law enforcement because even within the skill games setup, there are games that should not be out there in terms of how they take advantage of people. And there's no way there's no baseline, there's no regulatory opportunity for law enforcement to really deal with those systems.
Thank you, and I know that my time is probably limited, but I want to switch gears and ask you quickly about, at the end of January, President Trump signed an executive order that froze federal funding, among other things, and I really want to ask, what was your experience from where you were sitting when that happened? We've talked to some of the other departments about what they experienced, but what did it look like from where you were sitting?
It's an interesting time to be in this position. So, and this is very different from what will happen in the future for future budgets.
Yes. I want to focus just on that period between when the law,
So trying to understand what was actually happening, and this is a very administrative thing. You go into a system, put in your these are reimbursements. These are activities that we have grant contracts or contracts to do work. We've already done the work. We're putting in reimbursements, and all of a sudden the systems were closed. We could not file reimbursements, or it would say pending further review, or disappeared. And our team spent a lot of time to identify. I think it's 330 different lines for which we apply for, and there's a text chain with about, maybe 17, 18 people on it where I get a 3 times a day update over whether or not there's been a status change. And, the governor's lawsuit, after that, most things got opened up. I think there's one thing now that's closed that we're still trying to get, or 1 or 2 PEMA-related grants that we're still trying to get information on. But we have the baseline data that we can go back and sort of push and say, why is this closed? What's going on? And we can track everything. But there were risk points that we had no idea if anything was going to come through. There was a $1.8 billion reimbursement from Medicaid that was due that I told them I wanted basically hourly updates on to see that money come in. And everything came in, but it is, for what should be a very simple administrative process, it's a ridiculous amount of time by a lot of people to really keep track of.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much. I see my time has expired, so thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Representative Mustello.
Thank you, Chairman Harris. Mr. Secretary, we're faced with a $4.5 billion deficit if we pass this budget as is. And that deficit factors in even the newly proposed revenue that we've been talking about quite a bit today with the adult use marijuana and the skill games. So then that will mean that we're going to need to drain the $1.6 billion out of our rainy day fund to balance this budget. But by law, as I'm sure you know, that the rainy day fund can only be used when necessary to meet emergencies involving the health, safety, or welfare of the citizens of this Commonwealth to counterbalance downturns in the economy resulting in significant unanticipated revenue shortfalls. Now, earlier in these hearings, we had heard from Secretary Brown, and one of my colleagues asked if he is expecting a recession in the near future or an economic downturn. He shared that he is not expecting that. So, and he is expecting the economy to grow. So then, why do you believe it's appropriate to use the $1.6 billion out of the rainy day fund when the Revenue Secretary is not anticipating any sort of downturn in the economy? And as far as I know, we're not in a health emergency.
So fundamentally, whatever causes an emergency, the emergency will be the same. So last year, the Senate passed Senate Bill number 269, which was a massive tax cut, which not only would have done a tax cut, but also would have required us to send hundreds of millions of dollars back to the federal government because we would have exceeded certain ARPA requirements. And we would have had to go into the rainy day fund this year if that had passed and become law. If, as I was just discussing with Representative Waxman, if the federal government had stopped sending money, we would have not been able, we would have run out of cash in our general fund. If we do not have, and it's less about the continuing resolution next week, but if the debt limit is not increased at the federal level and the federal government cannot borrow money to pay the cash that we're supposed to get from them, which is billions and billions of dollars over the next few months, we are going to not be able to pay our bills out of our general fund cash. That's the emergency. And to have that while we have over nearly $8 billion sitting in the account, which has cash, and there are lots of discussions to have about whether or not we should be fronting the federal government, et cetera. But in each of those situations, the emergency is the same, which is we do not have the cash to pay our bills out of the general fund, and we need to pay our bills.
So then is there an opportunity maybe for us to look inward and make some cuts that we're not going to be so dependent on this federal money coming in? Why can't we maybe take care of ourselves here in the Commonwealth?
So I think there's two separate issues. We have basically since Lyndon Johnson have
You
built
have
up-
what?
Since Lyndon Johnson,
I'm sorry.
President Johnson, we have, I think the best way to describe it is this compact between the federal government and the state government of certain things that will be funded that we've all built. And this is not just us, this is every state in the union.
I'm very
And we're
behind.
far from the largest. And which is why I think there will need to be, depending on what happens, a re-examination of what all that means. That is not, we are at the same time doing work, someone mentioned REMAP and those issues and looking things of ways that we can use our funds more efficiently and effectively. And REMAP is not the only one, REMAP is, a bigger one, but there are different places where using the same funding where we're able to make things work more efficiently. Our permitting process is better, that's speed of business. There are SOUP, the space optimization plan, of how we can more effectively use our government resources, which will save money over time, $44 million by the end of 10 years. So there was a constant effort to look at ways to use things more efficiently and effectively. The type of numbers we're talking about with the federal government, when what we get from the federal government is projected to be $53 billion, is something that is beyond the realm of the normal kind of cutting and a resetting of that relationship,
Right.
potentially. And so I'm hesitant to mix the two. I understand your question.
So-
I'm hesitant to mix those two issues.
Right, because it sounds like you're just kind of moving the money around instead of maybe making cuts that might be necessary. Are you discussing other ideas of maybe where the state can raise some revenues other than, just kind of raiding the rainy day fund? Are there any other revenue streams that's being talked about if these cuts aren't being made because you're just moving money around instead of just
We have the
making
proposals
cuts?
that we have on the table for skill games, for AUC. Minimum wage is actually a net benefit for the change in the bank taxes, et cetera. All those are our current proposals. And by the way, we've been proposing them for a couple of years, and if we had enacted them when we first proposed them, we'd have over $850 million additional in the bank right now.
If we would have what?
If we had enacted when we first proposed either skill games or adult use cannabis or these changes, we would already have $850 million additional in the bank.
Okay. All right, I see my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady, Representative Brennan.
Chairman, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Last year, Governor Shapiro unveiled Pennsylvania's first economic development plan in nearly 2 decades, aimed at making Pennsylvania a leader in innovation and economic development. I've enjoyed going all around my district talking about that. I don't know how you could be successful economically if you don't have priorities, and some of those priorities are agriculture, energy, life sciences, manufacturing, robotics and technology. For the last few years here on the Appropriation Committee, I've seen the priorities that this administration is setting, and I've seen direct investment in our communities. My district particularly, there was a take-hack bill last year that created an agriculture advancement fund. We had funds come into Delaware Valley for a poultry processing center to come up with these new sciences to deal with complicated issues right in time for so many things we're seeing right now. The sites plan creates great opportunities for the things that we can be doing here in Pennsylvania. But I guess one of my questions is on life sciences. I am very happy that we have this $30 million investment in life sciences. We are investing in this industry. But I'm wondering, we see what other states have done. We've seen, Massachusetts put in something like $1 billion and had 30,000 jobs created, $7.5 million in new economic activity. New York, $1 billion in, 20,000 jobs, 1.5 billion in additional economic activity. New Jersey, even Ohio is doing this. I know we have to set priorities, and I'm happy that we're doing as much as we can in these industries, but is there more that we can be doing to focus on that particular targeted industry of the life sciences, particularly in this era where the federal government is retreating from some of these important advancements in health sciences?
So life sciences is a really interesting area for us because in some of those other places, they're trying to build an industry from scratch. And I know that, sorry, I'll get close to the microphone. I know the governor specifically called out that Boston and San Francisco have kind of become the hubs. What's interesting is because of the strong higher education institutions we have across the state who are in this area, there are So we're training workforce people, we're doing the discoveries, we're doing the research, and then it's monetized or becomes business elsewhere. And that's really frustrating. So it's filling that gap that we want to do, where the resources are here. How do we help folks develop that into a business model so that what they're doing, creating those businesses here, where they actually already are, where they are familiar, where the researchers are. So I understand your concern about, is it enough, which I think is fair. There's also a lot of existing private investment already because of all those things I mentioned. So the question is, what's our ability to leverage that to help push that along? And I think that's what we're looking at. And look, ultimately, Secretary Sagar is the best person to talk about this. I think about how we leverage that and the vision for going forward with that. And I also think it sends an important message just having a fun period, that this is one of the most significant investments, that we want to do something, we want to be a partner with this community. So it's not purely about the dollar number, as well as this is a priority that we want to do, we want to invest in. So I think the combination of that is helpful. Look, everyone's always going to want more. And I understand that it's my job to say no to all those things. So,
Well, and I have talked to Secretary Sagar about it. I know he sees big things in that industry. I know there are big things in that industry. And I do hope that we start prioritizing it more in future budgets. One thing I would ask you, though, is what, in terms of the sites plan and maybe even this investment in biotech, what difficulties are we seeing implementing some of these plans, like with our infrastructure? Like, I imagine we're doing these sites plans and we have roads and bridges that don't always support the things that we're doing. We have grids that are, that the AI that they might need in the life sciences just aren't sufficient for. And then I get so frustrated to see that we allow the Delaware loophole with all these folks that, aren't investing in our infrastructure, aren't investing in our, our workforce, getting a free pass while Pennsylvania businesses are suffering, and then we're losing these businesses. So maybe if you could just talk to some of those problems that we're seeing and roadblocks.
So I think one of the most important things is that, and you cited to the having the economic development plan and Secretary Sagar and his team, and what they've been really good at is listening, going out to the community and hearing what the needs are. It's one of the reasons that we have a focus on reimagining some of our tax cuts, because we have our tax credits. So we have tax credits that have been on the books for years that aren't being utilized. So why aren't people using them? So going out, listening, and understanding. That's the origin of the sites program. There were companies who wanted to come here, who were good with the workforce, no complaints about the taxes. What other places could give them is a site-ready site to go. So they're 6 months ahead in their business, 12 months. So as Secretary Sagar and his team listens, we're trying to have programs that are responsive to what businesses say they need to be, again, not to create something new, but to be that last dollar in to fill that gap so we can help leverage that with private sector, and also to increase flexibility, because I said government is usually not ahead of the game of where business is headed. So the flexibility we can have so that we can help meet the needs of businesses as they get to that point is the real goal of all of those.
Well, thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Secretary. If you do have any legislative proposals, feel free to send them our way.
Thank the gentleman, Representative Brown.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary Monson, this budget proposal continues to the process of filling an adequacy gap in education funding as determined by the majority report of the Basic Education Funding Commission, specifically by recommending an additional $526 million for the Department of Education's Ready to Learn block grant. Do you think this is enough funding to close the adequacy gap?
I think it's the next amount that's required to meet what has been said. It's the, that'll bring our total to over almost 1.1 billion, 1.05 billion, I guess, towards adequacy.
So you don't think additional funding is necessary in out years?
I think we'll be able to revisit that next year and see where we are.
Well, I'm a little curious as to why we didn't include that in the budget, the out years.
Well, we do have the money we're putting in this year maintained throughout the budget. So we're actually investing in adequacy over the 5 years about almost $5.5 billion, because we're going up to the 1.1 for year one, and One of the things that we have been adamant about in our approach to the planning years, and this was not always the case, discovered before we came here, is that sometimes you'd put in 1 year and assume it goes away. We don't do that. Everything that we have in here, we're assuming is maintained for every year. So again, we're going to as I said, about 1.05 billion for adequacy and the ready to learn if you take last year's plus an additional 526 in year one, and that's maintained throughout. So it's, again, almost $5.5 billion towards adequacy over the 5 years.
So does the governor believe this budget proposal continues to be a sufficient response to the Commonwealth Court's ruling on school funding dated February 7th, 2023?
Yes, it's meeting the obligation, and we do a 1-year budget every year, and that's what we're judged on. This is a 1-year budget, and let me be very clear, I'm not asking for 3-year authorization or 5-year authorization. It's a 1-year budget, and the 1 year, this is continuing to meet the findings of the court decision.
Well, there were 37 appropriations considered part of pre-K through 12 education in the budget presentation. 7 of those did show an increase in at least one of the out years. So again, I'm wondering why for this specific budgetary item it was not included. Because if we think we need additional funding in those out years, I think we owe it to our taxpayers to understand what it's going to be. And if in fact there is an increase, they need to understand that there's going to be a tax increase.
So across the 4 planning years, we show increases when there are required mid-year obligations like the MCO contracts and DHS. So we know that we have to renegotiate the contract mid-year because it's on a calendar year basis, so we have funding for there. Where we have existing labor contracts that have to be funded, we show funding until those contracts expire. I know in education, in Social Security, we have to show an increase because of it's when we don't control it, we have to show that increase, and those are the ones we choose to show. The areas where we have an appropriation process that we go through every year in conjunction with the legislature, it has been the practice for, according to the folks in my office, decades, that the out years are never shown.
I think it's a practice that probably needs change since we do know what we need and we should be budgeting for it. But moving on, many school districts are sitting on significant budgetary reserves. And when appearing before the committee, the PD acting secretary argued that school districts need to keep reserves and further stated to deplete it to zero would be irresponsible. Do you agree with this comment?
I'd actually take it a step further, that in most cases it would be illegal. And I say that because I think I apologize since I have the advantage of having been a district CFO, but most districts pay their teachers on what's called a 10-pay 12 schedule. So they work 10 months and get paid 12 months so they can help them budget. The way that works financially is out of each paycheck during the working school year, you take a portion of that out and put it into a reserve fund, which then pays them out over those 2 months. If you think about when those 2 months are, it's July and August. So as of June 30, you are holding the reserves of your entire workforce to pay them, or your entire school-based workforce to pay out over those 2 months. It's actually it's not a fair representation of the actual point in time. It's just a quirk of the way school districts work. So there's money in the books that look like it belongs to the school district. It actually belongs to their workforce. Obviously, the numbers I know about are much larger because I was dealing with Philly, but that's a piece of that. So no matter what, that's why I would say it's illegal to go to zero, because that money doesn't belong to the district.
Chairman, if I could just make a comment. I won't ask a question. I just find it interesting that you feel that way when in fact you're supporting a budget that's going to deplete our entire surplus of $8 million you inherited and begin to drain the rainy day fund of its current balance of $7 million. So just something to think about.
Thank the gentlelady. Representative Mullins.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Secretary, it's good to see you again. First, wanted to touch on research funding, most of which comes from the federal government. As you know, we have some world-class research institutions across Pennsylvania. We are truly blessed by those institutions and those people who find it their calling to try to develop cures and therapies for some of our most devastating diseases imaginable. And unfortunately, the the White House and this proposed budget at the federal level has proposed some devastating cuts to NIH and other research funding. When we had the chance to speak to Secretary of Health, Dr. Bogan, as well as the chancellors and presidents of the state-related institutions, many of them hosting many of these world-class research departments, and I raised the same question and concern. I would just like to hear from your perspective, the Budget Office's perspective, about what impact those cuts could have for people, for these research institutions, for lives and livelihoods that depend on it.
I mean, there are entire institutional units that are built around this research in biomedical, cancer research. I mean, we could be here all day just listing the types of research that happen. And so there are a couple, there's the good of humanity of things that won't happen because of this, which is not just a Pennsylvania thing, but I think countrywide, or won't happen in this country, and what that means for us. From an economic point of view, we often talk about eds and meds being major drivers of the economy, southeastern Pennsylvania in particular, but really across the Commonwealth. If that industry, I mean, it is an industry, and if it dies out, again, it's fewer researchers, it's fewer people coming here to study, people to work, people building up those laboratories that become centers of excellence. And if they're not here, they're not spending here, they're not living here, I mean, it has that same, all the things I talked about the positive impact of like a minimum wage increase and how that spreads throughout, you have exactly the opposite spiral effect down, and that you're taking a whole economic piece out of local communities where these institutions and where this research is happening.
I appreciate that perspective and that warning. If I can just switch gears to the Redevelopment Assistance Capital Program, affectionately known as RACP or RCAP. I mean, first and foremost, I guess I would like to take it as a nomenclature crusade to maybe rename the thing and just make it RCAP finally. But in the event I don't win that one, I am hopeful that we can re-engage this program and do whatever we have to do legislatively to make sure that that program remains strong, recapitalized, and able to be making those investments in our communities, which is not just a blank check or a grant program coming from the government. It requires that private dollar-for-dollar match within our communities. So I know there is a legislative component to making sure that program remains strong, but what is the Budget Office's view of the program's the state of the program currently, how much we have as far as unspent grant dollars out there, and what our plans are going forward?
I use the two interchangeably depending on who I'm talking to, which annoys everybody, so I'm not even going to say the name of the program at the moment. But it's actually one of the things, and I talk about how there's this constant focus on how do we reinvent things, how do we look at the way things are working. And one of the things I first did when I came in, and I had been on the opposite end at the school district, having received and the frustrations of dealing with it, and actually brought the staff in and said, what would you do differently? Like, why doesn't this work? And the most interesting thing was the first answer I got was, no one's ever asked us that before. And it tells you a lot about how we think about the work we do. And based on information from them, feedback from legislators, from folks in the community, from a lot of the redevelopment agencies who do this work, we did a complete resetting of the program, streamlined it, simplified it, stopped asking for information we don't use, and the number of, at every single level, every step of that process, we're processing them much faster. We actually processed $375 million worth of payments last year as opposed to 172 2 years earlier. We have $2.9 billion worth of outstanding projects, which are at various stages, and obviously the pandemic slowed some of that. We've streamlined our audit process, streamlined the way the consultants interact, so things are moving faster through the system, which is a big help. We also have gone back, there are stuff sitting on the books, which takes up some of the resources available, which were never going to be used, or programs that had finished, programs going back to Governor Ridge, that we would reach out to people and either no one knew what we were talking about, and there was sort of this sense that you just automatically renewed something. We've already cleared over $60 million worth of old projects out, things that were never going to happen, and we have made it a standardized process to maintaining a real review of what's out there to make sure that things are moving forward, because these were designated for specific projects. If those projects aren't going to happen, we want to reclaim the money so it can go out to other projects in the future.
Thank you, Secretary.
Thank the gentleman. Representative Barton.
Thank you, Chairman Harris. And Secretary Munson, this budget contains a lot of spending. Some of that spending is in areas I think that we all find very important, especially that of economic development. However, the budget is missing a necessary part of economic development plan, and that is harnessing our natural resources, and particularly coal and natural gas for energy. And I appreciate the governor's recent announcement of the Lightning Plan, but I can't help but notice that it still includes, and I'll quote as the PUC said earlier this week, Reggie or Pacer or Press or whatever we're calling it these days. I also can't help but notice that unlike the governor's first budget, this budget contains no revenues for the Reggie tax. Does that mean that you don't anticipate Reggie to be approved by the Supreme Court, and you don't anticipate Pacer and Press to pass the legislature?
It means we're being conservative, and I think there's language in the budget that refers to it, in that while it is under pending litigation, we don't want to assume revenues from it. So it's just an attempt to be conservative in our budgeting, because we don't know what's going to happen. It's just an uncertainty.
And I'll share with you that this is exactly why Pennsylvania won't be able to grow our economy. I could tell you that we've already had power plants close, like Homer City and Chairman Struzzi's district, and we're going to have our lunch eaten by Ohio when it comes to natural gas. Work is already underway for a $1.2 billion energy center in Ohio, Turnbull, Ohio. Of all this is just because of the threat of Reggie, the threat of Reggie. Should it actually happen, things are going to get much worse. Not a single utility-scale nat gas plant has been built since 2019. 22 states, including Ohio and West Virginia, are already have nat gas plants under construction. Furthermore, Mr. Secretary, renewable energy just isn't going to replace the baseload power that coal and natural gas plants are able to do. And so, once again, Mr. Secretary, is the policy of this administration, when it comes specifically to energy, to cave to the far-left woke ideology of the radical so-called environmentalists?
The governor has put out his energy plan, the Lightning Plan, as you mentioned, with its multiple steps, including Pennsylvania cap and trade, including sped up permitting, including helping out with pricing for consumers. I think the plan speaks for itself, and that's the governor's plan, and that's where it comes from.
Pricing for consumers, but if we're increasing, as the budget secretary, we're increasing prices by adding a tax to energy, that's increasing cost to all consumers. Can we agree to that?
I'm not going to comment on anything related to pending litigation.
Okay. Well, I will just ask you to please consider, Secretary, that if you want to see a real environmentalist, I'd ask you to look at a Pennsylvania coal miner, Pennsylvania oil worker, Pennsylvania natural gas worker, because those folks work in the field. They hunt in those fields. They recreate in that same environment. They breathe the air. They drink the water, they fish there, they raise their families there for multi-generations. That's a real environmentalist, and I just ask you and this entire administration to consider that when we're considering our economic development and the increase of using our natural resources, specifically our energy natural resources. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman, Representative Salisbury.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon. I want to shift gears a little bit and ask a question about how we are allocating funds across the Commonwealth with respect to demographics of different areas. So in my district in Allegheny County, where I represent District 34, I have 13 different municipalities. I was able to work with demographics and do some research on how much grant money has been allocated to each of those municipalities. And unfortunately, I found that per capita over a 14-year period, depending on where you lived, you either got $155 allocated, spent by the state grant-wise on you. So it could be $155 or $755. So there's obviously a huge swing in how much money we're spending per person depending on where you live. So I'm curious, on a larger scale, Commonwealth-wide, are we looking at a spending equity in terms of who's getting what, whether it's income level, Black and brown communities, areas of the state, that type of thing?
So I'm not familiar with ever looking at it in that lens. And part of that is that I would guess this is a multiplicity of lines. So there are obviously going to be some grant lines, whatever they are, that have either certain mission purposes that might not meet a given issue. If it's supposed to go to, if their funds directed towards a rural area, for example, it's probably not going to end up in your district versus, so it's kind of hard to take when you have disparate missions of grant lines and sort of combine them in that way. Something I guess we could look at it as what kind of data we could do, and if it really is like every dollar that comes out of the state government, not to mention the fact that obviously if it's just general fund dollars, or are we talking about federal dollars while they're flowing have their own restrictions and their own requirements and their own planning. So it's a little hard to conceptualize of it in that way. It's an interesting concept. I'm happy to have further discussion about it and looking at it that way.
The unfortunate thing that I found just looking at my district, and I can't say with any confidence whether this is true everywhere, although I suspect it's probably applicable across the state, is that the lower income communities that are not able to do grant writing as well, or not able to reach out and have the same resources to network with who they need to speak to, are getting the least amount of money. So for instance, I have a community that has a median income of $29,000 and $22,000. Those communities are getting far less in spend from the state than the communities that make $129,000 that might just be a mile away. So I just want to make sure that we are not perpetuating inequality or inequity across the state by spending more on the people who already have the greatest ability to get those funds from either their own tax base or grant writing.
So I think that's one of the issues we've been trying to look at with how we think about having a single entry point for all grants, and so that you don't have to have that special knowledge of those contacts or be able to afford to hire those grant managers who can go out and identify them for you, so that you have actual, it's kind of the government talks about a no wrong door policy. So there's one entry point that you can access all the grants. So part of it is even knowing that they're out there for those communities. And when I was CFO of Montgomery County, we actually did, Montgomery County has very disparate communities in terms of their income levels, depending on what jurisdiction you're in. And we actually created an internal grant manager position to support those committees, who was in my office, actually. And it's a concept we've kind of kicked around of how do we do that? How do we provide those kind of grant supports? But the first barrier we wanted to get through was having that everyone should know what's available. And I realize that doesn't quite get to the grant writing and all those pieces, but it's something that we do think about how we make sure that you shouldn't have to have the advanced resources for special knowledge to get access to grant programs for which you're eligible.
I see my time's about to expire, so just as a general request, excuse me, if you have that ability to pull that kind of information and see which counties, which areas are getting that type of money, I'd be incredibly interested to see that, just to verify if my own suspicions about these spending patterns are correct. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. Representative Krupa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Mr. Secretary. I have to say I'm absolutely astounded by what we're seeing in this proposed budget. The governor is hanging a significant portion of Pennsylvania's financial future on a revenue stream that doesn't even exist, because recreational marijuana is still illegal in this Commonwealth. It's illegal under our laws, it's illegal under federal laws, and yet somehow this administration wants us to believe that this imaginary source of revenue should be part of our state budget. That's not just unrealistic, it's reckless. Even if we were to entertain this idea, let's look at the facts. States that have gone down this path have seen increases in things like DUIs, traffic accidents, homelessness, truancy, addiction issues, mental health crises, all the way down the line. A study out of Colorado found that for every dollar that the state received in revenue from the marijuana industry, it cost society more than $4.50 in related consequences. That's not a net gain. That's a fiscal disaster. In your earlier testimony, you mentioned something about marijuana coming over the bridge, and it reminded me of that old adage. I'm a mother, so how many times have I told my kids, if all your friends are jumping off the bridge, that doesn't mean you jump off a bridge. And I personally would like to see Pennsylvania become a safe haven so that families that want to protect their children from excessive access to this type of drug can have a safe place to live, work, and study, and so that they can walk down the street without the horrible stench of pot. But the portion, or the notion that legalizing and taxing marijuana will be some kind of budget savior is an absolute fallacy. The long-term costs on our health system, our law enforcement, our human service agencies, our communities will far outweigh any revenue it generates. It's short-sighted, it's irresponsible, and it will have stark consequences for Pennsylvania. So I have a few questions. What happens to the governor's budget proposal if recreational marijuana is not legalized? What's the backup plan?
We have a comprehensive proposal of revenues and expenditures, and we will, as we do every year, have the discussion with the legislature about what the end result will be. I mean, we are not, this is not a dictatorship, not a king. It's a form of government where the legislature and the executive branch together will come up with a budget, as we do every year, and we'll work through it.
Tiffany, seems like it puts the cart in front of the horse to base a revenue stream on something that's not legal. Has the administration conducted any study on the true cost of legalization, or are we just banking on dollar signs without considering the damage that follows?
So a couple things. We have certainly looked at other states, their experiences, particularly those that are either difference between those that are they're the only ones kind of in an island who have it versus we obviously have most of our surrounding states have legalized it. The second piece is from talking to law enforcement and other folks that those...
If I could stop you right there, because I asked when the state police was here, I can't remember if it was last week or the week before, they denied ever having a seat at the table or any conversations with respect to these proposals of legalizing marijuana. And that's in direct contradiction to, I believe, your Senate testimony this morning and the statement that you just made. Can you elaborate on what conversations have been held with the state police?
The only reasons I know about the concerns that state police have are because of the conversations I've been in with representative state police about what their concerns are about the fact, for example, that there is no test for DUI from marijuana, et cetera, from things like that.
Was the commander present in that room for that conversation?
I would have to go back and look. I don't remember who.
Okay, because that was who testified that they were not included in the conversations.
I understand. To get back to my earlier answer, the impacts of marijuana are being felt already in the Commonwealth. There are folks, you know, I say this only half jokingly, when I was growing up, you crossed the bridge in New Jersey, which everything you learned about on the signs was what acts were coming to Atlantic City next and down the shore. And now it's all signs of where you can get it, and people are buying it and bringing it back, and there's a black market for it, and there are parts of, I mean, I ride the train every day, and I don't know what it is about Lancaster, but somehow the wafting comes in when the train stops there, and there are pockets throughout, so it's here, and we already have a lot of those impacts. We already have, what does it mean when there's marijuana in the workforce, and what does it mean when we have driving impacts, and what does it mean when we have addiction issues and hospitalization issues. So that piece of it's already here. We're not getting the revenues that we can actually
If I
use
could
to
stop
help
you
do
because
that.
I'm at the 30-second mark. I just want to say I think it's a fallacy, and I think it's very misleading that this is being proposed to be administered by the Department of Ag, because this is really an opportunity for big corporations and corporate interests to have a monopoly on this industry. There's been no proposal to include your local farmers across the Commonwealth. But in conclusion, my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I could just make one 10-second statement. Right now, it looks like we're planning a budget based on fantasy numbers and ignoring devastating consequences that other states have already faced. I urge this administration to rethink this approach before we put Pennsylvania on a dangerous and costly path. Thank you for your testimony here today.
Thank the gentlelady, Representative Bellman.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I had a couple of questions. The first question I wanted to ask is that we know that gun violence is down in Pennsylvania. This was something that the governor said during his budget address. And I know a lot of people in my neighborhood still feel the effects of gun violence. So I just wanted to hear if you could point out some of the aspects in the budget that specifically deal with gun violence and how we're reducing it.
So I think one of the biggest issues is continuing to increase the investment in the anti-violence programs, which particularly work with nonprofits through PCCD, getting the money out there, as well as the Boost program for after school. And again, I go back, I mean, obviously that program is only a year old, so I'm not going to try and draw that correlation. But the most vulnerable time for kids is that after school time that I know from my school district time. And the more we can have programs that provide alternative opportunities for kids, the more we're working with the community-based nonprofits who actually know what's happening, the more we can create the support systems, both for communities, but also for law enforcement for how they approach all these issues. You know, I think some of the mental health money that we're spending both in schools as well as in communities, we need alternative to disputes, is the best way I can put it. Everyone's angrier about everything. And unfortunately, they can do things beyond just, you know, punching someone in the face. And I do think that the more we can do to help people understand that mental health side of it, as well as provide the opportunities for others. So there's investments, building on investments we've already been doing, and I think that's part of it, as well as a concerted effort. And we think about, the government, again, talks a lot about doing things more quickly. One of the things we discovered was that prior year funding wasn't being spent quickly enough. So trying to understand why it wasn't going out, why it wasn't going to communities. And again, prior legislatures had identified the money to deal with this. It shouldn't be sitting somewhere. It needs to be getting out in the communities doing that work. So also speeding that up, working with PCCD to identify why it wasn't going out quickly, making sure it's being used. I think all of those are pieces of the puzzle.
Thank you for that. And to be clear, for the VIP funding, community organizations will be able to directly get funding from the state through VIP?
I believe so, yes.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that. And then I had a quick question on the Keystone National Finance Authority. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm familiar with the proposal or the concept. I think it's an interesting one to think about. I've had conversations over the years about the services it could provide that may not be available now, and how many folks are actually leaving the state to get financing outside the state. I do think we need to understand better what the potential impacts would be of the federal government changing tax-exempt bond rules and how that would impact the viability of it. But I think anything we can do to ensure that our institutions, et cetera, have the resources they need, that there is local buy-in, and that we are making sure there's availability is something we should be exploring and open to discussions about it.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it.
We thank the gentleman. Representative Eckert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Secretary Munson, for being here. I appreciate the opportunity to ask you some questions. First, I want to pick up where my colleague from Westmoreland left off, talking about, and you've been talking a little bit about this, how if we would have passed some of these tax proposals that we'd have some extra revenue. Has the governor or has the legislator introduced any of that legislation, the language to address what those look like yet? Have we, I mean, I haven't seen any. I'm just curious if that language has been formulated.
I have not seen that language. I know that things are worked on. I think we have a goal of putting out, I don't know if we call it a summary or a white paper of what the piece, I mean, we obviously have the pieces that are in there which underlie the assumptions that are in there, so we want to get that out so that it's very clear what the overall, all the pieces of the plan are.
Sure, and I would welcome that as soon as possible. Obviously, the details are always important in those situations. I'm going to switch gears quickly again, looking at the executive's budget. The governor proposed a $6.1 million decrease in the funding to the law enforcement activity after that had been increased a couple years. I think it's under PCCD's budget. I'm just curious why the governor is decreasing this funding for law enforcement under this particular line item.
I'd have to go back and look at it.
Yeah, and just so we're clear, it would be under the executive branch's law enforcement activities fund. It was increased by about $3 million over the last 2 years, and now it's kind of going back. So I was just kind of curious, you know.
Was it increased in the final budget, or was it in the proposed budget last year? Because I'm trying to understand.
First budget, yeah, it would have been in the first budget.
In the first.
Yeah.
Adopted budget or the proposed?
The adopted budget, yes.
Okay, so I mean, look, there are always pieces. I think we're consistent in our proposed budgets, and I think that obviously, as I've said before, this is a process of back and forth with the legislature and the governor to make sure that we can come to agreement on priorities to meet the needs of all Pennsylvanians, and obviously we'll have that discussion from, whenever we're done here today through, I'd say May to be optimistic, but let's go with June. Understood.
Well, let's talk to another complicated department, and that's the Department of Human Services. Obviously, the largest part of our budget every year. I think it makes up almost a third of the general fund expense every year. So we heard from the department this week about increasing costs in managed care and subsequent rate increases in capitated rates. Obviously, that's the biggest cost driver for DHS. For the contracts that went into effect on January 1st, how much was added to the base rates in terms of a dollar amount for capitation and the community health choices lines?
So I believe the increase is around $700 million. That's for the current year. That's as part of the budget proposal, for the spring update.
And as part of that $700 million, are we using prior year funds? How are we getting to that number?
I believe that's included in the update request as part of the budget for current year authorization.
Because obviously every year there's supplementals that come with this. It's natural as part of this process. And I know over the past I know House Republicans have been critical of these supplementals and being true about what it actually is going to cost. What have you and the Shapiro administration done to try to manage that and actually be truthful about what these true supplementals are? Trying to, obviously it's a prediction, but how have you guys managed that to try to, so that we don't have these large supplementals year over year?
So I think we do pretty well with the supplementals and projections. I know there are extremes. This was obviously an extremely unusual one. And I'll point out that the 5-year growth, the 5 year priors to this year, the average growth was less than 1.5%. So, and there are a number of reasons, and I think Secretary Arkush talked about certain drivers, particularly around the GLP-1s. And I will tell you, from a finance perspective, when you can identify what the driver is, I feel much better. When it's going up and you don't know why, that always concerns me more. So I know she outlined the plan better than I could about how we're going to try and control those costs. So I feel better about that going forward. I think in a lot of areas, we look at trend lines, we try to be cognizant of what's happening. There are obviously always going to be some unexpected issues that arise. We do try and cover costs where we can, or come back to the legislature with proposals of how we can use existing funds wherever possible. And I think we do a decent job, and we try to get as close to our projections as possible. But especially where you're dealing with an issue on the MCO rates where you have three factors. So it's capitation, its utilization, and its rates. You have all three different parts to it. And obviously healthcare has been highly volatile, and I think trend lines post-COVID have been challenging as well. So I'm comfortable with the approach we're taking and how we're doing it. And I disagree with your characterization of us not being truthful.
Fair enough.
But I do think that those folks do a good job at projecting with the information we have.
And fair enough, and maybe poor choice of words, but I think ultimately it's just about being transparent and trying to predict as accurately as possible, and I appreciate the answer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman, Representative Guzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Secretary Munson, for your time this afternoon. Secretary, as we wrap up these hearings, it's been clear to me over the last couple of weeks that the governor's proposed budget represents a strong commitment to Pennsylvanians by investing in three key areas: economic growth, education, and workforce development. While some politicians in this building claim that this is an unsustainable budget, the facts, as we know it, tell a different story. We're seeing initiatives that not only address our immediate needs, but by laying the groundwork, we are also seeing a long-term fiscal stability and prosperity. And so I have a few questions in regards to that. Mr. Secretary, wouldn't you agree that the governor's approach in prioritizing investments in education and infrastructure will generate returns that will strengthen the Commonwealth's economy over the long term?
Yes.
So following up on that, given the economic multipliers that we know that these investments will have, what do you say to politicians in this building that call for more cost-cutting measures?
I think when you have nearly $8 billion in a rainy day fund, and it's raining. I mean, we all know and we all talk about the fact that we have an aging population, that we have people who don't stay. I'm going to regret this for my kids, but I did it already in the Senate, so I can do it here. I'm a big fan of the movie Shawshank Redemption, and Andy Dufresne's line that you have two choices in life: you can get started living or get started dying, and we need to be living and investing and figuring out ways to not just accept what's happening, but actually make those changes, invest in our people, invest in our workforce, invest in our communities, so that people will want to live here, grow here, work here, and be here for the long haul.
It's raining in Reading, it's raining in Berks County, it's raining all across our Commonwealth. And so with these investments, I'd like to ask you now, in pivoting towards our revenue projections, isn't it true, in your opinion, that our current revenue projections account for future growth, ensuring that we maintain fiscal responsibility while delivering on our crucial promise to Pennsylvanians?
Yes.
So my follow-up to that is how would you respond then to politicians in this building that revenue assumptions are unrealistic, especially given our track record of meeting and/or exceeding revenue expectations in the last recent years?
The easiest way to say it, I said it before, our average growth is 3.1% over the 5 years. If you go back 25 years through good and bad times, the average growth is 3.6%. I think we're appropriately conservative.
And so, in your opinion, you believe that not only have we been conservative, but we're actually anticipating some of the shortfalls that some of my friends on the other side of the aisle like to talk about?
I think we accurately state what the reality is. do plan on dipping into the rainy day fund, but at the same time, I'll point out that we proposed in our projection, in our proposal, we will end June 30th, 2026 with more money in the rainy day fund than we had June 30th, 2024.
So we're going to have more money at the end of this year than we did this last year. Is that correct?
At the end of 26, yeah, actually both 25 and 26.
So let me wrap up my questions by saying this. Mr. Secretary, we've heard a lot over the last couple of weeks throughout these hearings about the investments. And quite frankly, what I agree with this budget is that it invests in people in the community of Reading, of which I represent. It helps the people of Reading in investing in our education. It helps the people of Reading in investing in our workforce development. And it helps the people of Reading by investing in the community needs that the people of Reading have. But I understand that this budget doesn't only help the people of Reading, it helps all people across all 67 counties. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And so as we continue to move forward in this budgetary process, what will you continue to say to politicians in this building who continue to say that this governor is driving us over a fiscal cliff?
I think we have, a budget based on reasonable expectations, reasonable assumptions that gets us another year further in investment. Government has a tendency to focus on what it spends and should actually be focused more on what it buys.
And what does it buy?
The future.
And what does that future mean for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle? What does that mean for us?
It means growing economy, jobs, families staying here, a future.
Thank you very much. Something that we should all want as representatives. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank the gentleman, Representative Marcel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us this afternoon. I know it's been a very long day for you. As you know, this year's budget proposes $38.2 million for debt service payments for the PA Sites program. The very first day of our budget hearings, we heard from DCD, and I asked the DCD secretary if he could share the terms, interest rates, if the authority was going to market soon, when, just so we can get a sense of the offering that was, and what it was going to look like. I was referred to you, so I'm very excited that you're here because it took the entire budget process for me to get an answer, and I hope that you can fill me in. So I heard from him that the bond was being priced the week of February 18th with the hope to close next week, which actually would have been last week. And so, so my question relates to that. So first of all, is that the timing before I go into my question?
Yes.
Okay. So the secretary noted that DCD has not waited for the money to be in their accounts to start the program, and as of February 18th, PA Sites has received 66 applications, estimated at $377 million. Further, this year DCD only has a total spending limit of $125 million. Is that correct?
Yeah,
just yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you. So, with that in mind, can you confirm if the PA Sites bond was priced last week, and if so, what are the total costs associated with the bond? What are the details that I couldn't get the very first day we started?
And in fairness to the secretary, it wasn't available. So the pricing went really well, and hit one of the few days it did not have high volatility in the market. We were oversubscribed by 200%, so we're able to push the prices down. In terms of debt service, we're probably $1 to $2 million below what we had budgeted for, both for this year.
And what is that total amount?
I'd have to go back and check. It's like $20 million a year, $22 million, I think, in year one was what we had budgeted.
So it won't be $38.2 million this year?
It has to do with the timing of exactly when the first payments are, so I'd have to go back and look, because when we're pricing, it depends on exactly. We were estimating based on when we would go to market. We got delayed a little bit on when we went to market, and then how much of it gets paid in year one and year two. But in terms of what our estimates were for the year payment, we're a little bit.
Is it possible to get that information so that we can see what the updated numbers are?
Yes.
And then what is that total debt service amount? I was looking at a sheet where there was a likelihood it could exceed $1 billion, and for a $500 million program, that seems a bit ridiculous to me. And so do you have a sense of, at the end of the day, what this is going to cost the Commonwealth?
So I'll have to get the exact number for you. I don't have that. What I can tell you is, so it will be different than our regular bond issuance because they were, we could not do tax exempt bonds for the sites because of the usage, so they're going to be taxable, so it's going to be a higher tax rate. It also cost us a little more because we were not granted we were required by the legislation to have the annual interest subject to continuing appropriation, and because that's an added risk to bond holders, we got dinged for that, so it cost us probably an extra $500,000.
So maybe that could have just been a program that we paid for through the budget as opposed to a bond offering, so we wouldn't be dinged for it?
No. When the legislature approves a debt bill, it can either be that the debt service doesn't require to be appropriated every year, which some of ours are done.
Correct, but I'm just saying, like, overall, if there's a concern about being dinged for something, it would have likely been better if we just used part of the budget to pay for it as opposed to doing a bond offering. My next question is any of the 38.2 million or whatever the number is as of last week proposed for the PA sites bond to cover costs for the program since DCD has not waited for the bond money to start the program?
I believe the program costs are all to support grant programs. I'd have to go back.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
I'm sorry, I believe that the proceeds are, other than that was used for closing costs on the bond issue, I believe are for a program for the grants. And I believe that DCD is covering those costs, but I'll have to go back and check on that and get back to you.
So basically, are they starting that program? Or have they already?
They've already started in the sense of getting guidelines. We want to be able to hit the ground running in anticipation of the money coming, so get the guidelines out, take in proposals, be prepared to go, so that we could, again, the goal of this is to get the money out there and doing stuff rather than sitting in an account somewhere.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady, Representative Young.
Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for coming. I know it's just you, but I'm still going to say Happy Women's History Month because it's important. Also, I am so appreciative of my colleague, Rep. Guzman, because he touched on a lot of things that I wanted to ask, but there was just two more that I would love for you to elaborate on for the constituents that we see every day and who are just listening to all the rhetoric that's happening in our nation right now. And so it would be helpful to hear from the Budget Secretary exactly what some of that means. So with our federal funding freeze, our lawsuits, our executive orders, the threat of shutdowns, those terms can be scary to the everyday person who is trying to live and work and just provide for their family. So in real time, from your perspective, can you share with us what kind of threat to the department, if certain systems are not paid into, what are the real-time threats for them?
So I think the first issue was obviously on the executive order related freeze of funds. So that's kind of this year's money. So as I mentioned before, those are funds that are programs we had contracts with, we did or are doing, and we submit for reimbursement, and we were denied that for a while. Those funds are flowing again in most cases. So the good news there is that we're getting the reimbursement, so that grateful for the governor's lawsuit and make sure that opened everything up and things are flowing. So that's good news, and obviously we continue to watch to see if there are any additional attempts to slow that funding. I think the next big issue is if the federal government shuts down. As I said, next Friday is the current deadline. I hesitate to say this because in the past, and I don't know if this will hold true, but in the past, even if there's a government shutdown, routine federal money like Medicaid reimbursements would still flow. I'm hoping that would be the case, assuming the government has money to give us. Federal government prints its own money and runs a deficit and sells T-bills and there's a debt limit on how much they can be in debt at any given time, they are pushing up against that. If they cannot borrow the money and therefore get the cash, they will not be able to send cash for us. So we would have a cash issue, and we would have to figure out how we would address that. And obviously that would depend on when that happened, when that started, and how long that lasted. And then the last piece is what does federal funding look like going forward? Which, all the issues we've discussed already, Medicaid obviously being the single biggest dollar number, but there are everything from environmental protection programs, health. I mentioned the ability to borrow money to invest in, for local governments to invest in projects. It really kind of runs across the entire gamut of pieces that are, in part, or almost entirely funded by the federal government.
So thank you for saying that. I will just say that with the Commonwealth having $7.3 billion, with the B, $1 billion, and our rainy day funds, it'll be interesting to figure out when it's going to actually rain if it's not raining now. And thank you for explaining to us who are the most vulnerable and who will be impacted. We already know what is happening and who will be impacted. So if there are any recommendations for this legislature, can you let us know what can we better do to prepare our constituents for what could possibly happen when it actually start raining?
I think the most important thing, as I think I mentioned before, is trying to make sure we have all the data and understanding everything, and that we keep in contact with you of what we are hearing, interpreting, seeing. Part of the issue is that a lot of the executive orders are either vague, or what they actually do is they direct federal agencies to come up with new regulations. So we don't even know what those new federal agencies or what those regulations will look like. I think the communication between our office, the appropriations chairs and the committees, so that they can relate to you, so you can relate that back to your constituents as we know more, is really important, and we try to maintain that level of communication at all times.
Appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank the gentlelady, Representative Kutz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Secretary. Thank you for joining us. I want to ask just about a specific initiative through the Department of General Services. Documentation from DGS concerning the Space Optimization Utilization Project claims it'll save approximately $180 million over 10 years through a reduction in leases. The same documentation also shows this initiative will cost $136 million over those 10 years, with operating expenses, personnel expenses being the biggest cost drivers. So the difference, the delta there, total saved from this initiative is about $44 million. Mr. Secretary, that cost seems just a little bit high to me. Can you please share more details about some of these specific expenses and why that cost might be so high?
Sure, and you're correct. I usually refer to it as a $44 million net savings, which, by the way, grows. Like, we thought 10 years was far enough to go out, but obviously the longer you're out of lease spaces, so the savings continues in the out years. So it's a combination of moving costs, furniture costs, some build-out costs for existing space where we have it to make. So it's not just about moving out of lease space into Commonwealth-owned space, but also changing the way we allocate space. So in private industry, and granted, there is a range across private industry, just as we have a range of services, but on average, I think it's something like 175 square foot per people. We tend to be closer to 300. Part of SOUP is realigning to about 200 square foot per people, as well as creating more shared space, more cross-utilization of space, so that if there's more larger meeting spaces, for example, which can be shared, so that it's not, this is, a Department of Education space that no one else can use if they're not using it, but other places in the building. And so I can speak from budget perspective. We're moving right now. I have folks in the top 2 floors of 333 Market who are moving over to the foreign building who are going to consolidate onto the existing space we have with building out the way the space is utilized. But there is a cost associated with the move, with moving things over, and with purchasing some new furniture, which increases accessibility and makes better use of the space.
I appreciate the detail. I was going to ask about 333, so that's also useful to know. Aside from reducing leases, are there plans to sell or demolish any current state-owned buildings or property? Or is it primarily just through leases?
So SOUP was not focused on that. It is kind of the next initiative that I know DGS has already started working on, and Secretary McNeil's team is very, very good at this, and has, I think there's discovering that there are things we don't know we own. Over decades, that kind of happens. So making sure that we have a full inventory of what we own. Is it needed? Can it be repurposed? How should it be best repurposed? Local economic, all those types of issues is kind of the next step.
Excellent. I appreciate that. I want to shift gears, if you don't mind, along the similar vein. Second largest employer in the district I represent across the river is the state government. So my constituents are invested in kind of what the administration goes in the direction you take here. So I'm curious, as the governor called in 2023 to reduce a new work from home rule to reduce senior management being out of the office. I'm curious, are there updates to the work from home policy that you anticipate? What's the current policy, and are we anticipating bringing more workers back in person?
So I think the current, I am not aware of any changes. I mean, just for perspective, currently about 63% of all employees are in person full-time every day across the entire government. I think it was fewer than 1,700 employees, like 1.7%. I think it's fewer than 1.6% are actually full-time telework. Some of those for accommodation reasons, for other reasons. The rest are a span, depending on the agency, of 2, 3, 4 days in person, and that can also depend on what the work is.
Sure, and I can tell you on experience, driving into Harrisburg a couple days a week are a little bit crazier with traffic. So I can tell which days the workers.
And I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but also just want to clarify that in person is not just in Harrisburg. We have sites all across the Commonwealth, which has actually helped us expand our workforce for people who don't live in Dauphin County or in the surrounding counties, but live elsewhere. It's helped with some cross-work for agencies that can co-locate in spaces, and has actually been a real boon to our hiring.
Excellent. Let me ask one final follow-up here. Given the governor's desire to kind of bring some more employees back while also reducing leases and space that we have, are you anticipating that means a long-term policy where you would not have the state workers brought back to work full-time?
So the remote policy and the space optimization are not related in that way. Like
they kind of have to be, though, right?
Well, they are, but because, as I mentioned, we're reducing the space per person, there would still be space if it were ever decided, and I'm not saying this is, or this is on the table, before I get misquoted on this, if it were ever deemed necessary for everyone to come back in, there will be the space for everybody because of the changes in that's the part of the space utilization optimization piece, is that the amount of space per person. Again, I'm not aware of any changes to the current policy.
Thank you for the clarification and the time, and Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank the gentleman, Chairman Struzzi.
Thank you, Chairman Harris. I know it's been a long day, Secretary Munson, but I want to thank you for being here. And I want to thank all the members who have been with us these past 3 weeks. I know it's a long journey for all of us to break down this budget, and I especially want to thank the staff members on both sides for all the work that they do. I think it's important that we appreciate, the effort they put in, working long hours and long days. So there's a lot to talk about here. I do want to clarify, though, that in fact, according to WeatherBug, it's not raining today. I say that jokingly, but it really is not raining. When we're looking at spending an additional $3.5 billion in excess of what we have in reserves and drawing down the rainy day fund, which is actually the budget stabilization reserve fund. So I think we need to be careful in how we are talking about drawing down our reserve funds, which essentially are there in the event of an actual emergency, not an increase in spending requests. And if we look at the current amounts in the Budget Stabilization Reserve Fund, as of right now, we have $7.4 billion, and the proposal is to draw down $1.6 billion from the Rainy Day Fund, which would actually leave us with only $6.4 billion in the Rainy Day Fund. So I think we need to be very cautious about talking about drawing down our reserves when in fact it is to accommodate additional spending. Now, There's a whole lot to talk about here. And I just want to go back to one of the questions that were asked earlier, Mr. Secretary, talking about some of the estimates, the IFO estimate related to the $80 million in revenue that would be generated. And then the governor, though, is saying, let me see, is this correct? Projection, 800 million more than what the IFO is predicting. So what I would ask of you as a follow-up, could you help us better understand this proposed tax and revenue modifications in the governor's budget and the potential impacts on the general fund? And if you could provide that information, and when will the administration's language for these proposed tax changes be available for review?
I think if you're referring to the skill games and AUC.
Yeah, the skill games and the
as I said, we're working on, again, for lack of a term, I'm kind of describing it as a white paper, or just which outlines all the pieces of it. So we'll get to that. We are working on it to get that to you as quickly as we can.
Yeah, we would appreciate that. I think it would be helpful for us to understand that. So, like I said, there's a whole lot that was discussed today, and I want to talk a little bit about the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and fossil fuels, and the fact that, you know, that proposal really has deterred investment in Pennsylvania for what now is the past 6 years. And I think it's disingenuous to say that those investments would not generate revenues for Pennsylvania. We know, as Representative Nelson outlined, that billions of dollars have gone to other states in investment because we have shut the door on those revenues coming to Pennsylvania. Do you agree with that?
Again, I'm not going to comment on anything with Reggie just because of the litigation that's
But if we had that investment, those investments here in Pennsylvania, though, that would generate tax revenues.
I think it's harder to do the but-for arguments. I really don't know.
Well, I'm pretty sure it would. And then talking about skill games, recreational marijuana, I mean, those are iffy at best. And we know that just to cover the amount of increases needed in human services because of Medicaid, we're going to need roughly about $1.6 billion, give or take. That right there draws down the budget surplus. So on top of that, we're spending or propose to spend another $1.5 billion. Would you consider that a good approach to balancing the budget?
So the majority of that is in education, obviously, in the adequacy, the $526 million, some additional funding in education. Again, I go back to the view, I believe, that there is, we tend to think again about government as spending rather than government as buying. And I think it's really it's easier, but the question is, what are we buying with the money? And I think it's and I know we're going to engage over the next several months, not too many, hopefully, about getting to a budget which has the priorities and what are we buying with those funds? Because the reality is what we buy will help define what we are going forward and what we're doing to grow Pennsylvania the way all of us want it to grow. So, you know, I'm looking forward to those conversations, and, you know, the way this system works, we get to go out there first with our comprehensive proposal. I'm hoping for, you know, rigorous discussion like we always have, going back and forth, and that we can get to something which gets the votes needed to get it moving forward.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate you being here. I think that we need to move forward more cautiously, understanding that we have to do investments, but also understanding that we have obligations that we need to pay. And spending on top of that when we simply don't have those revenues and we're drawing down budget stabilizations funds that are truly meant for an emergency in state government, I think is reckless and could be catastrophic for this Commonwealth. And I think we need to be more cautionary in those approaches. You know, the governor's budget proposal for the past 2 years has had significant spending increases, and this is another 7.5% essentially on top of that. At some point, I think we have to be realistic about our revenues, and hopefully, as the good chairman pointed out yesterday, we'll see that change in America. You know, we will see our economic situation change dramatically. But for right now, we have to deal with the numbers that are in front of us. And that's what I'm here, and I think that's what most of us have been here for the last 3 weeks, to break these numbers down and be realistic about how we're using Pennsylvania taxpayer dollars. And I look forward to those discussions in the next few months. But ultimately, we have to be responsible for those dollars. We have to meet the needs of our Commonwealth, but we have to do it in a more responsible manner. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Secretary, thank you so much for being here. Wanted to talk a little bit about, some would say the governor's proposal increased spending. What I know is that a lot of the investment that we'll be making is in areas that we're required to make, DHS, labor agreements, and the likes. Would you talk a little bit about how we're obligated to pay a lot of the increased expenses that we see in the budget proposal?
Sure. So obviously the single biggest increase is the DHS and the MCO rates. And that's based on an actuarial analysis, which is done outside, then approved by MCS, and then comes back to us, and then we negotiate based on those rates. It was, as I mentioned, the largest increase we've seen in several years. So we're hoping to control some of those costs going forward, but we have to pay it. We have those rates, we have those services that are provided and utilized. So that alone is, over the 2 years, is basically over $2.2 billion. And in this year alone, 1.6 something, 1.7. We have existing labor agreements with most of our units, and we always include costs of increases. If there's increases on healthcare side, that has resulting increases on pension side, all those types of issues get built in. I discovered that our benefit rate relative to salary is about 77% for most employees. Pensions is a large driver of that, but it's a significant number, so it's not just the salary going up, it's what that means for other pieces. The education funding is over $500 million just on the Ready to Learn, as well as additional funding for basic ed, special ed, and a few other areas. Those alone are the biggest drivers. Most of the other programs are either expansions of existing programs where there has been clear need. And as I said, they're all designed investments to address issues that are facing Pennsylvanians.
You talked a little bit about managed care costs and the increase. That's Medicaid costs for the most part. When we had the Secretary of DHS here, 3 million Pennsylvanians are on Medicaid. Almost half of that are children. These 3 million Pennsylvanians are sprinkled all out throughout the Commonwealth. What would it look like for us not to approve a budget that had the increase in Medicaid costs for the Commonwealth?
I don't even know if we could do it because they're contracts that are signed. We have to have the sign off. I think we would actually, and I would have to check with council if we would actually be forgoing our federal reimbursements. But that's, $30 billion, which seems like a really poor return on investment to not to approve the additional $2 billion if it would put $30 billion at risk.
So a big portion of the increase in our budget or increase that we are by law required to make, would that be accurate?
I think that's accurate, yes.
Okay. I want to talk about budget projections. We talked a little bit about this yesterday with the treasurer. I categorize budget projections as educated guesses. Now, I will heighten it and say that very educated guesses is what I'll say. But the Independent Fiscal Office has for 5 of the last 6 years been incorrect in their projections of revenue, and we have overperformed based off of what the Independent Fiscal Office thought we would do, which I would surmise is a sign of a good economy. Would you agree with that assessment?
I think our economy has performed well. I think it's also, every group who does analyses and projections, independent. Look, I was at an independent fiscal agency for 12 years. At PICA, I was executive director for 4 years. There is a natural conservative bend for those groups. I think, we try to be conservative and reasonable. Reasonable is actually what the PICA standard was. That was really what it had to be. And, forget the IFO, our numbers the last 2 years have come in ahead of our projections. We've been under slightly, and we're 0.4%. We're relatively close right now, and we'll see how the next few months go. So I think we're right in line. I'm very comfortable with our projections. And, I'm just going to stick with I'm comfortable with our projections, and we can talk later about the concept of an educated guess.
But though us overperforming was a byproduct of a productive economy.
Yes.
You would agree, right?
Yes.
All right. So a few nights ago, when the president took to the halls of Congress, he talked about golden age of America is back, and that under his presidency, his economy would be better than what we've seen over the last 4 years. So if the president is correct and his economy is better than the last 4 years, seeing as though we were over our revenue projections over the last few years under the previous Biden administration, if this current administration is correct, then you would assume that we would even outperform the last 4 years.
So it would be great if we did, because I have the last 5 years' numbers. So the last 5 years, our average annual growth was 5.6%, and we're projecting for the next 5 at 3.1. I would be very happy to have that happening and be able to come back here next year and have a conversation about where we are.
So if we're to take the president at his word, we shouldn't be talking about fiscal cliffs. We shouldn't be talking about a reduction in spending, because we should be anticipating that the next 4 years will be better than the last 4. Isn't that correct?
Given that set of assumptions, yes.
So if there are folks in elected office who are harping on the rainy day fund, they're harping on a reduction and a fiscal cliff, two things can be true, but in this instance, these two things are counter each other. If the Trump administration is correct and gives us the greatest economy that we've ever seen, better than the last 4, then we can't also be having a conversation about a fiscal cliff. I mean, I'm no economist. You do this work and have been for years. But wouldn't that be a fair assessment?
Yes.
Okay. So when we hear folks talk about these fiscal cliffs, then that must mean that they don't believe that we're going to have a robust next 4 years under the current president's administration. You can say.
Essentially, yes. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. I just asked, listen, I'm just a guy from South Philly. I didn't focus, I didn't, do finance like you did, Mr. Secretary. I'm still getting the hang of this, but I do know how to read a balance sheet, and I know how the economy works. And if the economy over the next 4 years is better than the last, we will do tremendously well as the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, correct?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. So with that, that's a wrap. We thank you so much. Thanks so much to the Budget Secretary for being here with us and answering our questions. We thank all of the secretaries and commissioners and department heads who have come before the House Appropriations Committee over the last 3 weeks for our budget hearings. We thank all of the members for being here. We thank all of our staff. Let's give all of our staffs a hand. Except the ones who eat peach rings all day. Never mind. Somebody ate all of my peach rings. That's all I'm going to say. Anyway, we thank all of our staff, seriously, for all of the hard work that they do. And with that, these budget hearings are adjourned. Thank you all.